Five, three. Hello and welcome to MATV on Sky 711. As you know, every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. UK time, we meet here with you. And normally we present a program called Kashmir in Focus. But today our program is Israel in Focus. And the reason is simple. The people of Kashmir in Indian Union territory and also in the Pakistani occupied Jammu Kashmir and Pakistani occupied Gilgit-Baltistan, they are very much concerned about the war. We have got a sizable Jewish community in Union territory, Jammu Kashmir in India. And our program wants to address issues that they think are concerning their day-to-day, media life. Like everybody wants to go on social media and they switch between channels to find out what's going on. And so sometimes we also present programs that deal with international issues that are of interest for the people of Kashmir. As we know, there's a war going on between Israel and Hamas, so we decided that today we are going to do a special program on the war between Israel and Hamas. A news channel has just claimed that the Israeli government has informed the Egyptian government of its intention to reach a ceasefire with Hamas. Well, how true is that? We are going to find out today in our program. And as we speak, the Israeli cabinet is in session and they are discussing about the current situation that has been created because of the Hamas. So we will discuss about that as well, which way is forward. Let me just remind you that during this war that has been more than a week now, an Iranian drone was shot down by Israeli defense forces, which is an evidence of the Iranian involvement, because they say unless you have an evidence, you can't just claim anything that seems to be hearsay. So there is your evidence. Another thing that I have been saying in all my programs, which have been about Israel and the war, is that the Hamas army, the military of Hamas, the terrorists of Hamas are trained in Pakistan. They are trained in Pakistan Military Academy in Abbottabad, from where a stone throw away Osama bin Laden was hiding for years. Also, they are trained in the Naval College in Karachi. They are trained in War College in Islamabad, and also in the Rasalpur Air Base, which is an Air Force college to train people for the Air Force. And also Navy, military, artillery, all sorts are being trained there. And they are paying Pakistan to do that. And where do they get the money from? They get the money from United Nations, because the UN gives grants to the Palestinian Authority. I think it's about $250 million a year. So they pay out from that kitty. The former United Israeli ambassador to United Nations, his name is Dan Gillerman. He has said that Iran is using its proxies. In the south, they are using Hamas, and in the north, they are using Hezbollah against Israel. Similarly, the mullahs in Iran and I add Pakistan have pledged to destroy Israel, and this is no secret. The current ambassador of Israel to the United Nations, Dan Gillerman, has today just walked out of the General Assembly meeting when the Palestinian foreign minister accused Israel of committing war crimes, and Pakistani foreign minister was there with him and showed his solidarity with the Palestinian foreign minister. Today, I have got a special guest with me in this program, He is a peace campaigner. He belongs in peace for Palestine, peace for Israel, and love for Israel and love for Palestinians. And he is the chair of Glasgow Friends of Israel. Every week they have a stall on Buchanan Street in Glasgow where they distribute leaflets about Israel, and also are available for any questions that any passerbys might have to ask them. Their stall has every now and then faced violence from the so-called liberal left, and sometimes also from the Palestinians. So today I would like to welcome Mr. Sammy Stein. Thank you very much, Mr. Sammy, for your time, for joining us in this show. Thank you.
Hello, Amjad, and it's very nice to see you again. We met for the first time a few years ago, and then unfortunately we lost contact. But I'm very pleased that we have caught up again, and I hope that after the pandemic is over, we can actually meet face to face. That would be great to do that.
That would be great. My first question is Israel desperate to pull out of this war because they think they are being overwhelmed by the Hamas rocket fire?
Can I just, I will answer your question, but before I answer that question, you introduced me as the chair of Glasgow Friends of Israel, which is who I am. And you said a couple of words about our organization and how we normally have a peace advocacy stall in Buchanan Street in Glasgow city centre. And what we do there, we try and just speak to people about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And we are a peace advocacy group because we wish to have peace for both the Israelis and the Palestinians. This is a leaflet that we give everyone that walks past our stall. And what it says is...
Can you raise it and bring it closer to the camera, please?
Closer to the camera. It's difficult to know exactly where to put it. But for there to be peace, Israelis and Palestinians need to promote each other's welfare. Not their own welfare, but each other's welfare. And that is the only way that we will have peace. And we have a very interesting slogan. Don't know if you can see that.
Yeah,
which says,
put it in front of your face. And I'll ask the studio to bring you in full frame.
Pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace. And we have a flag that is made up of both the Israeli flag and the Palestinian flag. Because in order to have peace, we need both people to have peace. You cannot have peace for one side. And that is why we promote peace for both sides of this long enduring conflict, which we hope one day soon will come to an end. Now, to go back to your question about Hamas and does Israel want out of the war? Well, I would say Israel didn't want to get into the war in the first place. There are casualties on both sides, and there are civilian casualties on both sides. And it's terribly sad that adults and children are being killed both in Israel and in Gaza. The problem we have is that Hamas is the administrators of Gaza. And I don't believe that they have the interest of the Palestinians in their heart. They are far too interested in their own political ambitions and their desire to get rid and annihilate the state of Israel. I have brought with me, again, something for people to know about. There's something called the Hamas Charter. And anybody can Google the Hamas Charter. To my right, okay?
No, to your left.
To my left, okay.
Yeah, that's it, that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
And raise it a bit, raise it a bit. That's it, that's lovely, yeah.
Anyone can Google.
Yeah, can we have a full frame, please? Can we have a full frame? Yeah.
Yes, anybody can Google this and see it on the internet. Let me just read two little paragraphs from this charter, because it's quite a long charter. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. So as far as Hamas is concerned, they will obliterate Israel at some point. Now, the other little thing I want to read to you, initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. So Hamas is desperate to annihilate Israel, and it's trying to do so by firing rockets into Israel.
यार बैकग्राउंड में
Now,
आप लोगों का स्टूडियो का शोर आ रहा है. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
That's okay. Some people say that Israel should not retaliate and Israel should not bomb areas in Gaza. But if you were experiencing 3,000 rockets coming on our heads in Scotland, what would you expect your government to do? Would you expect your government to sit there and just watch and say that's okay? Or would you expect your government to defend its people? And that is exactly what Israel is trying to do. And clearly, I think Israel would like to have a truce, and they are waiting for the right time to have a ceasefire because they have a number of objectives that they need to try and complete. Because what Israel does not want is another flare-up with Hamas in a year or two, because it's bad for both the inhabitants of Israel and the inhabitants of Gaza. And so what Israel is trying to do is create a situation where Hamas will not be able or capable of starting another conflict in order to kill citizens and children of both sides.
Can I just ask you, how did this war start? What happened? They say that there were some Muslim from Hamas who battled rocks into the west side of Aqsa Mosque, which used to be Mount Temple. So I would like you to briefly let our audiences know about that. How exactly did this start?
Okay, well, it really started about a month ago when Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinians in the West Bank, decided that he was going to cancel the elections that were going to take place in the West Bank. He did so, I believe, because he thought he was going to lose the election. He wasn't going to get enough seats in the parliament, in the Palestinian parliament. So he decided to cancel these elections. Now, in order to divert people's attention from that cancellation, he started encouraging Palestinians to riot on the Temple Mount by saying that Israel had plans to take it over and to let Jews pray on the Temple Mount, something that Israelis are not allowed to do. And that created an environment where Palestinians were very concerned about what would happen on the Temple Mount. And they decided to riot and demonstrate against these fictional actions that Mahmoud Abbas said Israelis were going to do. And of course, as soon as they started rioting, then security forces come in to try and stop them rioting, and the situation gets worse. Now, as you mentioned, Al-Aqsa is the third most important site for the Muslims in the world. And yet, these Muslims were stockpiling rocks, heavy rocks, inside the mosque in order
I think we have
to
an
attack.
image of the rock. I will ask my studio to display the image of the people who are carrying those rocks. Can we do that
Yes,
now,
please.
please? Yeah, carry on, carry on. You carry on.
And so the Palestinians inside the Temple Mount and inside the mosque started throwing these very heavy rocks at the Jewish worshippers at the Western Wall, the most holy site for Jewish people. Now, for those who don't know, the Western Wall is at the bottom of the Temple Mount. So if you're in the Temple Mount, you can throw stones, heavy rocks, on people below you, and you can obviously do them a lot of harm. So again, the police, the security forces, tried to stop the hooligans and rioters doing this. Now, I don't agree with security forces going into holy places. And I think it's usually wrong for security forces to enter such a holy place. But when you're being attacked by people throwing rocks at innocent worshippers, something has to be done. And that was the reason that I believe the security forces, unfortunately, had to go into the mosque. Now, what happened then is Hamas decided that it wanted to be seen as the protectors of Jerusalem. And so they decided to oppose any activity that the Palestinian Authority was doing, and they started firing rockets on Israel, saying, we are the protectors of Jerusalem, and we are trying to do something about what is happening in Jerusalem. And so Hamas started, there we are, there's the photograph, and you will see some of the Palestinians inside the mosque. This is inside the mosque, and on the bottom right, you will see a pile of rocks. Why should there be a pile of rocks inside the third holiest place in the Muslim religion? There's only one reason to have those rocks there, and that is to throw them on innocent worshippers at the bottom of the Temple Mount. And so Hamas decided it was going to be seen as a protector of Jerusalem, and it started firing rockets into Israel. Now, when Hamas do that, they have fairly lethal rockets, but they're not easily controlled. So when they are fired into Israel, they could land absolutely anywhere. And they are firing them at civilian areas where they will kill and injure innocent civilians, both adults and children. And that is what they were trying to do. And therefore, at that point, Israel had to respond and say, unless you stop firing these rockets, we will respond. And that is how the war started.
So now, what is the current situation now? I mean, everyone has been watching television and news channels, and everybody is trying to find out. But since you have connections in Israel, and maybe you have family members there, and maybe you have been talking to them, what is the latest update on the situation, the morale of the people of Israel, the Jews? And can you also, after answering this question, carry on with my answering my second question? What do you make of the riots that are going on inside Israel between Muslim Arabs and Jew Arabs?
Yes. Well, firstly, I think just the same as the people in Gaza are very unhappy with what is going on, and a lot of, some civilians are getting killed. People in Israel are also very unhappy with what is going on because people in Israel are also being killed. And I think that is bad for both people. Now, some people say that Israel is acting out of proportion because more Palestinians are being killed than Israelis. Now, does that mean that if more Israelis were killed, that would be okay? No, of course it doesn't mean that. We don't want anybody to be killed. The difference between the two is that Israel has provided shelters for its civilians where they can go when they're being attacked, whilst unfortunately the Palestinians living in Gaza do not have that facility, and therefore they tend to be more exposed. Hamas, yes. So it's more difficult to keep the civilians alive in Gaza. Now, another thing that I would like to mention for people to think about is in the Second World War, about 5 times as many German civilians were killed compared to British civilians. So does that mean because more German civilians were killed that the Allies were the baddies, so to speak? But of course that's not the case. The Germans started the war, they initiated the action, and unfortunately, towards the end of the war, more and more German civilians were being killed by the attacks of the Allied Air Force. And that is the same thing as happening in Gaza. Unfortunately, there are more people killed in Gaza than are killed in Israel, but that doesn't mean that Israel is not doing its best to try and target Gaza. Because if people say that Gaza is the most populated refugee camp in the world, now, considering how many bombs have been dropped by the Israeli Air Force, and I think they're saying between 200 and 300 civilians have been killed, and half of those are probably terrorists, if Israel did not try and be more specific in targeting these things, then I would think thousands of civilians would be killed, not just a few hundred civilians would be killed. So Israel is trying to do the best it can to target only terrorists and only areas where rockets are being fired from. Now, with regards to your second question about what is happening inside Israel and the conflicts between the Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, I think that is a terrible, really very sad development. Because for 70 years, in general, the Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews have lived together in peace. Now, there are many cities in Israel where the Arabs and the Jews live next to each other. And these are the ones that have been, to some extent, been in the news. So places like Lod and Haifa and Nazareth and many other cities where Jews and Arabs live together. And I think it's very difficult now to see how this issue will be resolved because it's sown some very difficult seeds in the country. And it's very, very important that the Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews work together for the sake of everybody living in that country. And I do hope that once this conflict is over, that the two sides of Israel, because they are both Israeli, the two sides of Israel will get together once again and work and cooperate with each other to make life a better place in Israel.
So, you recently wrote a letter to the Scottish First Minister, which is equivalent to a Prime Minister. And can you tell us something about that letter? What did you write, and what made you write this? We have got the last 3 minutes, and I give you the floor.
Thank you. Well, I wrote the letter because on social media there was a statement from the First Minister basically criticizing Israel for what was happening and saying how Israel should never have gone into the mosque. And we haven't spoken about the Sheikh Jarrah situation, but she mentioned Sheikh Jarrah and how Israel was evicting people, which was against international law. But by the way, it's got nothing to do with international law, the situation in Sheikh Jarrah. It's a legal dispute between an owner of a property and a tenant in a property. And it's got nothing to do with the Israeli government and nothing to do with international law. But her statement was very one-sided. It talked about Muslims in the Middle East and Muslims being killed and Muslims worshippers being killed. But she said nothing about the Jewish people who are involved in this conflict. And the First Minister has always said that as long as she is the First Minister, there will be no racism or anti-Semitism in Scotland. And her statement, I'm afraid to say, has actually increased the level of anti-Semitism in Scotland because it was so one-sided. So I decided to write.
Have you received a reply from the First Minister?
No, not yet. I hope
you do. I hope you do, and thank you very much for joining us. And in today's program, we have tried to have an unbiased review of the situation in Israel, the reasons for the recent war that is still ongoing, how peace can be reached, and you have heard it straight from the horse's mouth. Sammy Stein is himself a Jew, and he is working for peace. And there are many Jews who are working for peace, but they hardly are brought into the limelight. Thank you very much for watching. We will join you again on MATV Sky 711 on Tuesday.